Aslam Alaikum, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Isolation Central. This is episode number 19. इसका मतलब है कि it's been almost 3 weeks, more than 3 weeks in Pakistan since the lockdown began. The point of this program was to mainly address issues related to coronavirus, but every now and then we also, because it's an opportunity, everyone is home, so we are making most of it by talking to different people, different content creator like artists, writers, and today we have a very special guest with us. We have Uzma Aslam Khan with us. She is an author. She has written 5 books already, and we'll be talking about her work. So first of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, both Hammad and Fatima. Really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. So I think the starting point should be कि आजकल क्या हो रहा है, आपका क्वारंटाइन कैसा जा रहा है?
So as I was discussing with Fatma, first I want to say that I just feel really blessed that I have a home, to be quarantined in. This is something, I recently moved to this house about 4 or 5 months ago, and it's a slightly roomier house than I was living in before. I think if I had been living in the old house, I would be feeling more claustrophobic because I tend to not like closed spaces and I tend to need to sort of move and be outside. This house is a bit roomy. I was telling Fatma that I sort of arranged my computer so that you could see my walls, which I've painted. And, I'm living in the northeastern United States now, and it's been a long, cold winter and a very dark one. So I do things to sort of brighten up the interior. So that's one way I'm coping, is to sort of add light inside the house and to enjoy the space that I have. The other thing is that the house is actually in the country, and I take a lot of pleasure from sort of being around birds and trees. So I do a lot of bird watching just around this area, which is very quiet, and it's very forested. So you could say that it's already very isolated when it comes to people, but because I don't really mind that so much, or maybe I've just become used to it because I've moved so much. I tend to kind of be a loner anyway, and I don't feel alone in the company of trees and birds. And I've been doing a lot of bird watching just from my kitchen table. Sometimes I see all kinds of things. And I've been keeping a bird journal for a very long time. So I've started doing that again. I had stopped and now I'm doing it again. And, I can spend hours just sort of observing birds and their behavior, not just identifying them, but just sort of observing them and noticing like which bird will go to which branch and which one is sort of looking around for predators more, and which ones are sort of more aggressive. We have a bird feeder, so there are some that sort of hog the food, and there are others that are kind of very polite, like chickadees are very courteous birds, and they sort of wait for their turn, and then they just take one seed and they go away, whereas there are other birds that just sort of hog all of it. So there's a lot to do even in isolation. I will admit that one of the things that of course I'm worried about is I'm actually an asthmatic, so my asthma flares up anyway around this time, and I know that there are some people who have to be extra careful, because if you get the illness, then it can be worsened if you have previous conditions. So I'm worried about that. I'm worried, of course, about my loved ones. I'm worried about joblessness and homelessness and people who are forced inside who don't have good homes. There's a lot to think about right now. Yeah.
I think a good starting point would be looking at that birds and taking away the fact that you should only take what is your requirement, rather than just holding everything like we started doing.
That's really true. I mean, it's true, right? When we went to the supermarket like 3 weeks ago, it was amazing. The shelves were totally empty, and I was like, what? I mean, thoda sa to rehne de. And it's just like, and I actually, when I saw the chickadee, I was thinking to myself that this chickadee has better manners than a lot of the people around me right now.
Because I actually, saw a person who was taking away bread, like 12, 10 breads. now you possibly cannot eat all those breads in next 2 days. And if you're not
Exactly.
going to eat them like in next 7 days, they're going to get expired. So there is no
That's
point in hoarding stuff like that. But शायद इंसान ऐसा ही है at times
right.
कि हो
I,
जाता
I know, and that pain of knowing that all that stuff is going to be thrown away
Yeah.
because it will go bad is really sometimes very painful to think
है.
about.
Fatma, you have a question?
Yeah, so moving on, the main reason we invited you was to, thoda sa light more and, add some variety to the subject. So let's just talk about your writing and your work. And मेरा पहला standard question होगा, so at what point did you decide कि आपने writer?
It was never, Fatma, a conscious decision for me. When I was a child, I just used to scribble, and I remember I lived in London. The first time I knowingly recorded history and recorded something was actually, I've always loved animals. So in London, and because I'm asthmatic, I was never allowed to have a pet. So in London, what I used to do is when we would go for walks, I would very slyly, without anybody noticing it, sort of touch dogs as we walked by. And then I would come back to our apartment and sort of record which dog I had touched at what day and what time. So thinking about this now is funny because, all these decades later, in a way, I'm doing that. What I did with dogs, I'm doing with birds. Um, but knowingly, I think the first story I wrote was about a horse, not about a dog, but it was about a horse, and it was about a princess and a horse. Everybody around me in London, they were taking horse riding lessons, and I wasn't able to because they're expensive. So I decided, well, one way to have a horse is to create one for myself in my imagination. And so I wrote the story that I wanted to be living. I wrote about a girl and her horse, and that was when I was 6. But it never was something that I told myself, that I want to be a writer one day, or I am a writer. I don't think I allowed myself to think that till my first book was published in 2001. So it's been almost 20 years. And now, yeah, I can comfortably say this is me. This is how I think. This is how I function.
So can you just, elaborate a bit on the time period or the journey from, wanting to be a writer, and then, you said when your first book was published, when it was official, you had that first book in your hand. So you want to share a journey between, were you working on something else? Did you have a job, or what were you doing
Yeah,
before that?
I've always, had to sort of support myself with other jobs. I mean, I think very few writers can actually subsist on their writing. So that, I've done many jobs. I remember when I was writing this first book, The Story of Noble Rot, I was doing 2 other jobs. I was actually working at kitchens. I was serving food. Then I did other stuff, like I was a cashier. This is when I was in the US. So, and that was an adjustment, right? Because in Karachi, provided for in Karachi. And then I went on a scholarship to the US, where I suddenly was not privileged enough to be cared for. I had to care for myself. And I'm very grateful for that because, I have a friend who told me that, once you've worked sort of in the kitchen industry, you will always have a job because there's always need for that, right? so yeah, I was doing all these things, and then the first book took a long time to find a home because I tried an agent in the UK who told me something very interesting, which I recently shared when I was in Karachi with some students, which is, my stories are always about mostly about Pakistanis who are not visible or powerful or, marginalized voices. It's more the people who we overlook. So this first book was about class. It was about a rich woman and a poor woman. It was about a maid and the begum who kept her. And I remember when I tried to ask I contacted an agent and she said, nobody's going to be interested in this in the UK. She said, for us to read this book, us meaning white people, or the British who, well, the industry is run mostly by white British people. She said, you're going to have to introduce a Jemima Khan-like character. Can you imagine? And she said, that will be your bridge character, because in order for us to relate to these people, we need someone that we can relate to. So basically what she was saying is that we can't relate to brown people, and we can't relate to, like the tussle between the rich and the poor in Pakistan. And in my story, the wealthy woman was actually poor in childhood. She came from a rural background and she married a man who was wealthy. So there are all these sort of nuances of class in the book. And she said, first of all, she said that class doesn't exist in England anymore, which isn't true. It very much exists. So she told me to insert this Jemima Khan-like character, and I said, no, thank you, and I left. And then ultimately, I found a publisher in India, Penguin India, an editor who's still with me 20 years later. She's the one who published my newest book, The Miraculous True History of Nomi Ali. So that's how it happened, but it took me about 4 or 5 years to find a home for that book, because I kept getting those kinds of responses. And they taught me a lot, Fatma. They taught me, that there are things I will not compromise on. I mean, if these are the characters I want to write about, then these are the characters that I must write about.
Yeah, so talking about that, I read one of your interviews in the thesis book, Writing Pakistan, I think I forgot the name of the author, who has compiled these interviews of Pakistani authors, and you are one of them. So I would want to ask, and I really liked a couple of answers you shared there. This not compromising on the characters you want to write, and then this industry that is being coded by people who, I mean, it's surprising for me to listen to the fact that even somebody in the UK saying they can't relate to something that's happening in this area, despite the fact that they've ruled this area for so long. How do you then, make a stand, or how do you said you found an author in India, but given the dynamics of the industry, is it very easy, or is it possible for every writer to be able to stand and say, I don't want to compromise, or there are times when you are pressured into, making some adjustment, because specifically for those who are using this as their main source of income?
I mean, I can't really speak for every writer. I can only say that I did take this stand with the first book. It was costly though, because I didn't find a publisher. It took me a very long 4 or 5 years, I think it took. So I finished the book in 1996, I believe, and the book came out in 2001. So it took me a very long time. But you just have to be true to yourself. If what you are being asked to do feels wrong, then you have to take that stand for yourself, for the work that you've put into the book, the writing, the characters that you've grown to love and to value. And if you feel that they are worthy of someone's care and love as much as yours, then you can't abandon them and say, well, for the sake of XYZ, I'm going to make you less important, and I'm going to add this figure because this is the one that they want to read about. I can't do that. So that's all I can really say. But yeah, I mean, I will share that it can be costly, because you're told, I still hear it from publishers, we like your writing, but the story is hard to relate to, or the characters are hard to relate to. This is something that I've heard with all my books.
Before we move forward, I think this is the right time to ask, talking about stands, taking a stand. We have a question from Ramsha, and she's asking that, could you please talk a little about your experience and memories of life through Zia's regime, and how did it nurture the idea of geometry of God?
That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, I went to St. Joseph's Convent in Karachi, and it's interesting because we moved from London to Karachi just before Zia took over. And it was a confusing time for a child anyway, right? I was only 10 years old, and to have to navigate, London and then Karachi, all these changes was difficult. But I remember one very clear memory that I have is on Independence Day, walking between the statue of Jesus and Mary and the Pakistani flag. We had to march, we had to march, and Zia's voice booming on the loudspeaker, and it was and the legacy of colonialism in Pakistan, and the ways in which we inhabit all these contradictions. So here I am attending a school that was set up by the British, that is I'm mostly being taught by nuns, but I'm also being told to be very religious and an Orthodox Muslim, and there was a certain kind of strictness, kind of binary worldview that was developing at that time, where you to be good you had to do this, and if you did not do this, then you were bad. And so I think it was very much the beginning of my understanding of these different forces: colonialism on the one hand, military dictatorship on the other hand, also the Afghan war, what was happening in Karachi, which was a kind of a second partition because of the internal conflicts. So all these conflicts were beginning to be seen by me. And I think I don't really know how that became the geometry of God. That process is always a mystery, but I think just I'm not really sure how those years exactly led to the geometry of God, but I do think that all of that fermentation that was happening, me sort of considering all these different opposing forces and the binary world that we were suddenly inhabiting, which was very genderized, and where ethnic differences were becoming very demarked in very frightening ways. All of that, as well as religious extremism, all of that sort of was something that I was beginning to have a consciousness about, and I think I wrote the book in part to sort of explore that landscape.
So Uzma, talking about your characters, जैसे ये तो specifically आपने उसको explain कर दिया. In general, मेरा एक और pet question होता है that I like to ask authors is, do you have like a set pattern here? You have a storyline in your mind first, and then you have characters that help you build, or you come or कोई एक character पहले develop होता है and you take that character and then you develop the story.
It's more like the second one that you said. I mean, I never have a plot line or a storyline. I often say that when I write a book, I think I'm in the driver's seat. I think I'm in charge. I think I am, but very quickly the characters take over and they sort of push me into the passenger seat, and they're the ones driving. So that's why you have to kind of empty yourself also of ideas and sort of even hopes that you will go somewhere, because your characters may take you somewhere else. They'll take you on unexpected routes. And ultimately, that's the joy of writing, is being surprised. I don't think any book ended up where I thought it would end up. And so I've sort of become used to and even desirous of not having expectations. I just try to embody the character and the language. It can take a very long time to find the language for a book, as much as the structure of a book, because each book has started very differently. For example, Thinner Than there was a photo book began, but it's not actually the first scene in the book. Geometry of God began after I had gone. I was living in Lahore at the time, and I had gone to. And I remember before going to Malaysia for a vacation, I had been struggling with this book's point of view, like it had been a third person point of view. And then I came back and I was very jet lagged. And I woke up one morning actually with Amal's voice in my head. And I quickly wrote down, I wrote that whole book on Kleenexes. This is a true story. Like tissue papers were just everywhere in my house. And I wrote down on a piece of tissue paper what Amal said. And I knew I had her voice. I knew that this had to be a first person book. And I knew that Amal's tone, her attitude, her language, like I finally found it. With the Miraculous True History of Nomi Ali, it was because this book took so long. It was, this has been almost a 27-year journey. It was never going to be a first person book, but there were going to be letters in it. Those letters in the book are some of the first parts that I ever wrote. So, and the prisoner in the book is the first character that I ever wrote. But, she doesn't open the book. So you never know where these parts that you're writing in these bursts of inspiration are going to actually fit in the overall structure of the book till you go through the every demand of the book, every emotion, which includes getting rid of certain chapters, getting rid of certain characters, and then bringing it all together at the end. And then you realize, oh yes, this fits over here, it doesn't fit over here. So yeah, I don't have a plan. And that's why it takes so long. That's why it's sometimes maddening. Why can't I write a book every 2 years? But I just can't.
So I don't know if this is sort of a question asking because many people say, they have association. Obviously, because you have created something, you have a specific set of association with something. But is there any specific character from all the 5 books that's more favorite, or you have or maybe not just favorite, but a character or the writing process had something very interesting that will always keep that character at a in its own specific level of pedestal.
Since I'm the mother of all these characters, I can't really pick one out. I will say that for the new book, the prisoner was the one who started the book. So I'm very attached to her. I mean, I carried her for 26 years and I've never held someone for that long. She was with me through so many very pivotal moments of my life. Some difficult moments of my life. And so I've had so many changes. I've been sort of so disrupted and displaced. To have something anchor you is when you find that, then that character will always occupy a very special place for you. It doesn't mean she's more special, but it does mean she's special in this very unique way. Nomi, when I found Nomi in the book, she completed the novel. So The Prisoner began it, but once Nomi came to me, she helped me tie up all these loose ends, which I had been carrying for a very long time. So I think of The Prisoner and Nomi in this book as a kind of, dual compass. Like they really directed me. But then there are other characters like Heather Ali in the book also tugs, and I also tugs. So it's hard to say.
Talking about Nomi Ali, Sana Munir says that Nomi Ali was among my top favorite books of 2019. Love the details of the Andaman and Nomi.
Thank you so much. Yeah. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So we'll just talk a bit more about this book. This book is based on a section of her history that I didn't get to read and study about in my school.
Yeah.
And after reading it, I've also been, I'm the sort of person who wants to read something or see something. I have to, be the total nerd and do some extra research. And it sort of baffled me why, given the fact that, when we are taught history, however flawed it is for anyone who has history they have read history other than what has been taught in school, at times you are shocked at the contradictions. The idea of the sort of identity we are told and the sort of the way it is ingrained in our educational system, and ask, why was this not taught? That's the question I have. So I would like you to share that because you write in the book at the end that you went into the library looking for something else, you came up with this book, the idea of this book.
Yes.
So just share what was your feeling when you got to know about this, and all the process, the historical process that you went through in doing the research, How was that experience?
Yes, no, that's a great question. Thank you. It was, I think in 92, that I did go to the library looking for another book. I was doing, I was doing a research project on something else. I was at university, and I had told my professor that I want to change the direction of my learning, and I want to write on this, not on this. So he said, fine. And so I had gone to the library to find something that would justify my sort of switching my focus. And instead, I pulled out this book, which had a quote by, the Home Secretary of British India from the 1930s. And he was talking about a prisoner paradise. And the quote, which I don't have in front of me right now, but it was something to the effect that, it is not imprisonment, but only banishment from home. And I remember just like the book opened and I thought, that's impossible, right? I mean, there's no such thing as a prisoner of paradise, and there's no such thing as weighing exile, and look at us here in isolation now talking about this, right? So when you force someone so many thousands of miles away from you, and you lock them up and you forget about them, that is eliminating their story, their history, their memory, their not just their ties to their community and their family and their loved ones, but you are removing them from consciousness. So that really stuck with me. And as I say, I think in that interview, I didn't find the book I was looking for, but I found one I had to write. Just based on that quote, I knew that I had to write this book. But what book? I didn't know, because I didn't know this history, because as you said, we weren't taught this history in school. And that's when I began to think a lot about the history that I was taught and what was left out of my own learning and why it was left out. I really believe that when things are left out, it's deliberate. It's not accidental. That there is no such thing as non-selective learning or teaching. And we're all raised in every country, in every culture, to know some things and not know other things. So the question was, why was I not encouraged to know this? And so it was a road that I embarked on, is to sort of find out what history was kept from me and why it was kept from me, and who was writing the history that I was supposed to know. And of course, all these questions lead, as they do to actually all my books, which is a question of power. Because to have the power, as we know, history is written by victors. So why were the stories of the people who were actually sent to the prison island, which is the Andaman Islands? And at the time, like many of us, I only knew of the Andamans as, Kala Pani, a place of horror to which prisoners were sent. But I didn't know actually where it was on the map. If you had shown me a map, I could not have pointed it to you and said, this is exactly where. I didn't know how many islands there were. I didn't know who was living there before it became a prison island. I didn't know how it became a prison island. So all of this started sort of feeding into my process of trying to write this book. And I realized that there was very little written on it. That it had been extremely neglected, not just in my school or in Karachi, the history that we were taught there, but it had been neglected by historians who were regarded as sort of World War II experts. I mean, I didn't even know that the Japanese had occupied this island till quite far into my research. So then I became kind of obsessed with this dual occupation, that these islands were first occupied by the British, then by the Japanese during World War II. And what about the people who were living under both occupations? And I, of course, found this at a time when, there was a war in Afghanistan. And so there were these two sort of superpowers battling each other, Afghanistan and the United States. And here we are squeezed between military dictatorships and then democracies that are supporting these military dictatorships. I felt like I could actually really relate to this story from 70, 80 years ago, where people were squeezed between powers. And I became more and more fascinated and more determined. But it took me a very long time to find the material, and then it took me a very long time to let go of the material, because it is ultimately fiction. And I wasn't setting out to write a history book. I was setting out to write a story. And to write a story in an actual time and place, which is what historical fiction is, you have to do your homework, and you have to know the history, but then you have to not be bogged down by the history and sort of burdened by it, and burdened by the question of accuracy, which is that you don't want to say something that may not be true. So you let go of factual truth and hold on to this imagined truth, which is your own unique way of telling the story, depending on the characters that you've imagined. Most of my characters are made up. Z in the book is one of the few characters who's actually based on a real figure, but Nomi Ali, for instance, is completely made up. And the prisoner is completely made up, because though we know that women were sent to these islands, none of the books that I read actually mentioned a woman prisoner by name, not one. So in my book, I also eliminated her name to highlight the fact that women's names have been removed from our memories and our histories.
So I think we have two questions, and you have answered one completely and the other one partially. So the first question was that, the Nomi Ali is a political statement on history. So do you think literature navigates us to reconsider the tempered history? So I think you just talked about it right now. That's how we're. And second question is really interesting. So it says that, could you please talk about the neglected role of women in politics? So even today, we are finding it a bit hard to so women can become a part of state politics, state level politics. So can you talk about the neglected role of women in politics?
So that's a great question. I think for certain, we are still living in a time where we think, because there's more conversation about feminism and women's rights, it's very, very easy to think that women have equal opportunities now, but of course they don't. And not just that, but you see this in small spaces like our homes, like our job spaces, like even the writer's life, like, how many women writers are reviewed in major periodicals and newspapers versus men. So anytime a woman has visibility or voice, that is still seen as something to question or be suspicious of. And if she is confident and she has opinions, then it's, like, negative labels are attached to that. Whereas when a man is confident and opinionated, positive labels are attached to that. So so it's very easy, actually, if you think about this, to take it a few steps further and say, well, then women in politics, women in, leaders of nation states who are women come under scrutiny far more than men, because they were under scrutiny before they got there in the first place. They were under scrutiny, when women teachers were under scrutiny. I teach, so I'm using that as an example. But we are always held to a different set of standards, and we will be, regardless of which space we occupy, until we actually look within and try to dismantle these double standards of these hypocrisies, and question and also accept that these things are not accidental. So this sort of leads to the answer that I was giving to Fatma earlier. When something is left out of our history or our memory, it's not accidental. And I think when there is casual injury, when certain labels, negative labels, are attached to women, it's not accidental. It's because these things have become normalized, they have become a habit, and they are perpetuated between generations, and often men to women as well as women to women. And we have to talk about that as well.
Okay, so my next question would be that you have also shared, and I think you have said this before in your interviews as well. You have traveled a lot. You've lived at multiple places as whole period of your lifetime. Just want to ask, how has that impacted your writing style? Has it made it easier to empathize? Because at times once we are like, we just have a specific set of surroundings, it's very hard to, think from the other person's perspective. And after answering this, we would like that you please read a bit from your latest novel.
Okay. So yeah, I have moved. Some of those moves have not been chosen. My father used to work for Pakistan International Airlines, so that's why as a child, like we worked 1 year here, 1 year there, 1 year there. Sometimes I didn't want to leave. I became attached, and it was forced displacement. But that also inculcated a sort of restlessness in me that I've carried into adulthood, where now I'm almost afraid of settling down. So it's the other extreme where I want to keep moving. And for a writer, I think movement is very important because it's not just physical movement, it's also emotional, intellectual, spiritual movement where you want to constantly challenge yourself to go somewhere you haven't gone before. In terms of like how all this has nurtured my writing, I think it must have a lot. I think many geographies have informed me. I think I'm very curious about places that I haven't seen, and I'm, like the Andaman Islands. But I also think that one of the major ways it helped me is, I'm a Muslim woman from Pakistan who never knew what it was to be not the majority demographic, right? So, but because in Karachi, I didn't know, but because I had spent a lot of my childhood in places where I was a minority, I think my empathy for minorities and for people who are marginalized and sort of do not share power and do not have a voice in decision making at the national level as well as in other spaces, developed as a child because of this. One of my very, very strong memories when I was in London, I was 6, I lived there between the ages of 6 to 9, was, this was in the 70s, and London was a very difficult place. It still is for Asians, but at the time, the racism was very overt. And I remember that I was alone a lot of the time. I didn't, children didn't want to play with me, and I didn't know why. Because I was a very sporty child and I loved to play. I was a tomboy and I wanted to play all these sports that everybody was playing. And but I started realizing, you know what, they're not picking me on their teams. And I feel like a lot of the lunch break would be spent on a bench, sort of watching other people play. And I think that inculcated in me a sensitivity toward the person on the bench. Like, who isn't being included? Why? And I think a lot of my books, and the new one, Nomi Ali, is in large part about racism. When it's racism under the British as well as racism under the Japanese, which is what colonialism normalizes. But it is also racism within communities and the ways in which communities that have been colonized sort of perpetrate this violence, which is what racism is. And so I've sort of, I think I learned that by moving around so much and by often finding myself in a place where I was a minority of 1 or 2, or certainly not in the majority. Yeah.
Please read.
So I think I'll read you just a little part of the book. Which is right at the beginning. The book begins in 1942 when the Japanese come to the islands, and Nomi and Z, her brother Z, are sort of trying to understand these changes, like where has everybody gone? So this is, the first chapter is called The Night They Took Z, and it's 1942, and Nomi and Z are going up a mountain that Nomi calls Mount Top. They started climbing. Their mother never allowed them up the mountain that Nomi called Mount Top, but Nomi had been here once before. It was their secret, hers and Z's. There were no Indian guards telling them not to go up. There were only the Japanese, some lying in the grass with their boots off and long guns to the sky. They said things hard to understand, but did not stop Nomi and Z from continuing. For a few steps, it was just the two of them. Then more olive green uniforms, different up here against the bushes and down there against the sea. And again, Z gripped her arm, and again she wanted to be home, but they kept climbing. There was the lake they had been to before. Then, a little further through the paddock trees on the summit of the next hill, they saw it, the jail. Shaped like a starfish and the color of a wound, its 7 arms severed by the tall, tall trees. This was as far as she had ever come before. The higher up Z took her, the more the ocean flew through the trees, and she tried to focus on this because it was beautiful. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Uh, Before we wrap up, my last question would be: what are you reading these days? Are you reading anything, and would you like to recommend any authors, any specific books that can? Because there's an, as we were discussing offline as well before we went, shared this with the audience, that there's a heightened level of anxiety felt around the globe. Everyone can have their own reasons, and just the main uncertainty that we are facing, that not knowing what's what's there in the future. So any books that you go to when you are in that state of anxiety and that help calm you down, that you would like to recommend?
Well, I'm not sure these books are going to necessarily appease anxiety. I feel that through reading, regardless of when, I mean, I empathize with the heightened level of anxiety right now, and I sometimes I share it too. But I feel like with reading for me is a very calming activity, and it's not calming in the sense of sort of mollifying or suppressing that kind of calm. It's just a way for me to find a home, and it's a way for me to have empathy for other people and not sort of only think about my own immediate environment and my own immediate needs or fears, but so that when you go, it's a transporting activity and it's very active. So to be someone else for a time is what I mean by calming, because I find it kind of liberating to be someone else. It gets tiring to just be in your own head all the time. So with that in mind, I'll mention a couple of the books that I've recently read. One is this book that's been sitting on my bookshelf for a long time that I finally read because I have the opportunity. It's called The Hen Who Dreamt She Could Fly. It's by Korean writer Sunmi Hwang. Apparently she's very well known and well loved in Korea. This is a little book, and it's a lovely book. It's sort of part fable, I would say, and part a book that is sort of passionately about environmental justice. It's also a book about love. This hen is, well, I'm not going to give away her story too much, but I would say it's about love, and maybe in particular maternal love. And maybe it's a book that I would especially recommend to Desi mothers who can be very sort of overprotective sometimes and a little clingy of their children. This is a hen who learns to let go, and who does it for the benefit of the child. It's also a book about adoption, and that's interesting too, that we don't talk about that very much in Pakistan. It's who's in our community, who's the outsider, and what does it mean to bring someone into your home. So it's about a lot of things. I would definitely recommend this. It's written in a very delicate style. This writer has a really light touch. It's almost deceptively light, so that you don't realize the philosophical questions that she's actually posing. So that's one book. Another book that I recently read, which I love, is called There, There by Tommy Orange. Tommy Orange is a Native American writer, and this is his first novel. It's an enviable first novel. It is so just linguistically perfect. I mean, it's just at the sentence level, it's such a joy to read. It's about several Native American characters growing up in California. And he, we were talking about racism earlier. I mean, the Native American community is a community that has been represented by, in the movies and books and in popular culture by people outside of the Native American community. So here is a Native American writer writing about his own community without Jemima Khan characters. So I would highly recommend that one. There are a couple books that I'm looking forward to reading that I have not read yet. This book has been recommended here before, and I would say that I'm dying to read it. Snuffing Out the Moon. This is by Osama Siddiqui. It's next on my list. It's right at the top. I'm also going to reread The Conference of the Birds by Fariduddin Attar. I read this book. I think most of us have read this. It's an epic poem. I read this book about 30 years ago. It was a translator called Shole Wolpe, and she is a poet herself. So I'm very interested in reading her translation of this poem. And then lastly, I have on my list a book that I want to read. It's called No Visible Bruises: What We Don't Know About Domestic Violence Can Kill Us, and it's by Rachel Lewis Snyder. I haven't read this book yet, but the reason why it's also top of my list is because I heard an interview with this author on a TV show some months ago. And one of the things she said, which really, well, two things she said that really struck me was, because I think it's applicable everywhere in the world, and including very much Pakistan, is the things that are justified because it's out of love, you know? And this idea that, and between people who love each other, that it can't be a crime. And I think we have to dig very deep and interrogate this. And maybe especially these days, because of the lockdown, we are all hearing all over the world that cases of domestic abuse have actually spiraled upwards. It's terrifying. And the children who are trapped in these home environments, the sort of what they are internalizing about what is okay and what isn't okay is something that we need to talk about much more. So I would highly recommend this book. The other thing that she said, which struck me, was this idea of coercive control, which is also something we, you know, I mean, Fatma, you've read my book, so you know that a lot of them have to do with, you know, the big conflicts like war, colonialism, you know, religious strife, but they're also very much interested in how family dynamics are shaped by these wider conflicts, and why the family conflict is seen as the smaller one when it often isn't, because it is within families that these larger dynamics are perpetrated. I mean, obviously, all these power these power dynamics at the national level are shaped by people who come from homes. So it's really important to sort of see both what's happening outside on the so-called bigger stage as well as inside, and particularly in how it shapes girls, you know, and I think I'm very interested in looking at wider definitions of violence. This book is No Visible Bruises. So we're looking, you know, it's about the invisible bruises. It's about emotional violence. It's about verbal violence as much as physical. So that's on my list. I don't know if it's going to, you know, appease this difficult time and sort of lessen the anxiety, but I would say that this is an opportunity to sort of change, right? I mean, people are saying that too, is that here we are in this moment in history where we can really examine our own behaviors and what behavior we normalize, and find a space within us from which to do that. So I would say, you know, go for the joyous books like the Hen Who Dreamt She Could Fly, and the slightly heavier, more demanding books. I think both, there's room for both right now, for sure.
I think it's a great list. Dr. Osama is also on our list. So hopefully he'll be joining us sometime soon, and we'll be talking about something about the moon as well. But I think, well, let's wrap it up here. Thank you so much for your time and such a beautiful talk and engaging conversation. And I hope to see you again on our show sometime later. But meanwhile, stay safe. Uzma,
Thank you. Okay, Khuda Hafiz.
thank you.
Others.